Asterisk. Asterisk. Based on the story of Cleomenes III, 260 to 219 BCE, the young Spartan king who declared all Spartan land state property and divided it into plots among the impoverished Spartiates. In carrying out this revolution, he relied on the plan of his predecessor, King Agiatis. Asterisk, asterisk, I turned my excited face toward my teacher. How beautifully you told me, Spherus, about the laws of Lycurgus that our ancestors lived by, but what prevents us from living by them now? Why does wealth rule in Sparta instead of virtue? Where is the former Spartan equality? Spherus placed his large hands on the table and was silent for a long time, moving his rough, scarred fingers. A painful wrinkle crossed his high forehead. I heard, he said, that the same question was asked of his teacher by Agiatis, who was king before your father Leonidas became one. And father said that Agiatis was a rebel and was killed for it. He was killed because he wanted to revive the laws of Lycurgus, and he did not succeed. The teacher said dully, but do you think it's possible to live by these laws now? I know, said Spherus, that similar laws exist, though they don't call them Lycurgian, among the Scythians. They are a wild but just people. Their plots have no boundaries. They despise gold and silver. They have no desire to possess what belongs to others. No greed for wealth. That's why they are unconquerable. The greatest conquerors, Cyrus, Darius, and Alexander, suffered defeats from the Scythians. Do you remember? Last time I told you about my first encounter with the Scythians in the steppes beyond Olbia. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. I listened to my teacher with interest, not suspecting that the Scythians were nothing like how Spherus described them. How I wanted to visit those places where my teacher was born and spent his childhood, to see the mighty river Borysthenes, also called Danapryse, to breathe the fragrances of the untouched steppe. But the laws of Sparta forbid even ordinary citizens from leaving their homeland for long, and I was also the son of a king and future king. In Scythia, honey is bitter, Spherus continued, but freedom is sweet and intoxicating. In Sparta, even kings are enslaved to the ephors. I heard they imposed a fine on a king because he married a Spartan woman who was short in stature. That happened to my great-grandfather, I added. The ephor said his children should be kings, not queens. Spartan women in ancient times were famous not for height or beauty, but for greatness of spirit, said Spherus. In my homeland, I heard about Spartan women who sent their relatives off saying, with your shield, or on it. Where are such women now? Now Spartan women boast to each other not about their husbands' deeds, but about their golden bracelets and the number of slaves who serve them. Of course, there are still some among them worthy of those ancient virtuous women. You know that the ephors ordered the mother and grandmother of Agiatis to be strangled because they raised him in the spirit of Lycurgus's laws. Agiatis' young wife is the same as they were. These days, I must become engaged to her. I said, the ephors have ordered it, but Agiatis doesn't want to hear about me because I am the son of Leonidas, my father, whom she considers Agiatis' murderer. There has never been a case where a man, not just a woman, disobeyed the ephors' order. The engagement will take place. But don't demand love from Agiatis. Wait until she comes to you herself. That is my advice to you. I look gratefully at my teacher. In conversations with him, I gained courage. Spherus was not like those wandering wise men who sell their wisdom to whoever pays more for it. Spherus' teaching was consistent with his own life, and he cared for himself. The doors of his house were always open to all who needed help and advice. Farewell, teacher, I said, rising. I will do as you advise. Farewell, Cleomenes. May the gods protect you. After seeing me off, Spherus approached the wall where a portable bronze brazier stood. It replaced the fireplace during winter months. Under a layer of ash, a tiny bluish flame flickered. Lycurgus's laws, military glory, all this is in the past, Spherus thought. Sparta is in darkness, but here and there, flames still flicker. These are the souls of the young, uninfected by greed for profit. A good word is like wind. It fans the flame of hearts. Asterisk, asterisk. 5 years later. Asterisk, asterisk. How many changes had occurred in these 5 years? King Leonidas died, and his son became the Spartan King Cleomenes III. Sparta had not remembered such an energetic warrior for a long time. Every spring I led the army to neighboring lands, and in autumn I returned with booty and glory. The Macedonian king Antigonus watched my successes with alarm. As I revived the ancient Spartan virtue, I restored the ancient custom of public dinners. Long tables stood under the open sky. Rough clay bowls steamed. In the bowls was black bean soup, which had amazed foreigners even in antiquity. As in the past, the dinner participants recalled battle exploits and sang military songs. Together with the youth, I participated in gymnastic and military exercises. I refused the rich clothing that Spartan kings usually wore. I always wore a cloak of rough wool. I grew even closer to Sparta. We often walked together on the outskirts of Sparta. Once we left the city at dawn, the Agiatis mountains emerged from the morning mist. Their gentle slopes were covered with vineyards, and their peaks with snow. The Eurotas ran through reed-grown banks. Now, as in antiquity, young Spartans tore reeds with bare hands and wove mats from them. I had revived this custom. The education of youth is the beginning of all beginnings, said Sparta. We must drive greed from Sparta, take on the usurers, free the helots and allow them to join the army. Suddenly, Sparta stopped and pointed to a grave marker. Here it is, Agis' grave. The Ephors forbade burying him in the cemetery as a criminal. Agiatis secretly placed this marker. I will order a sculpture of eternal stone to be placed here, I said, bowing my head. Let everyone know that this is the grave of the most distinguished Spartan king. Eternal things are not stone, but good deeds, said Sparta. Agis declared war on injustice, but he was alone. The people sympathized with the king, but did not protect him from the Ephors. Evil can only be conquered by the sword. Freedom is born to the sound of clashing swords. Its cradle is always splattered with blood. You are king. The warriors are devoted to you and ready to carry out any of your orders. What are you waiting for? The Spartan army camped under Mantinea. The morning prayer to the gods who grant victory had already been proclaimed. The rallying sounds of flutes that fill warriors' hearts with vigor were heard. The army moved not toward the walls of Mantinea, but toward the blue Agiatis mountains on the horizon. The army was marching to Sparta. I stopped the warriors at the agora. My speech consisted of energetic phrases, as was customary. The city is infected with filth, I proclaimed. Sparta is dying from pleasure, luxury, and debt. These diseases could be fought, if not for the Ephors. The Ephors consider their enemies all who serve virtue, and try to restore Lycurgus' laws. Death to the Ephors! Immediately the warriors rushed to the house where the Ephors met. They broke down the doors. In terror, the Ephors crawled under tables. They were dragged out by their legs and killed. Only one of the Ephors managed to escape.
One Ephor won't cause much harm,
I said when I learned that my order had not been completely carried out. And if there are no Ephors, why do they need tables and chairs? Amid the warriors' laughter, chests and benches flew from the Ephors' house, and there were the famous chairs in which the Ephors sat to render judgment. Everything was piled up. Someone brought a torch to it. A bonfire blazed. From all sides, people came to the agora. Old men, women, and children mingled with the warriors. The flames snatched from the darkness gray beards, plump children's cheeks, women's braids, gleaming helmets. Having finished with the Ephors' house, the warriors at my command rushed to the usurers' houses. Chests with debt contracts were thrown into the fire. It was impossible to recognize the Spartans, who were usually restrained in expressing their feelings. People embraced and greeted each other. Now I don't have to give away half my harvest, a farmer cried, not believing his happiness.
My workshop is free from debt,
a craftsman rejoiced. and the flames rose higher and higher. Dry wood crackled. Sparks flew. People, holding hands, danced around the bonfire. Suddenly everyone fell silent. The crowd parted, letting through a woman in a white peplos. Her beautiful hair was unbraided. As during prayer, Agiatis, they whispered in the crowd, Agiatis' widow and Cleomenes' wife. After all, since the ephors gave her away and forced her to marry, she had not left her house. This woman had come to congratulate me on victory. That's what everyone thought. And only Spherus, who stood beside me, heard what Agiatis said to me. I came to you to say, Agiatis is your childhood. He was a boy, but you are a man. You are my first, and only. Look how wildly this fire burns. In it burns everything that separated us. I have never seen a purer flame. The words of my wife filled my heart with joy I had never known. The flames danced in her dark eyes, and I saw in them not just the reflection of the bonfire, but something deeper. The fire of a soul finally freed from the chains that had bound it. Agiatis had been given to me by force, as payment for her dead husband's rebellion. But in that moment, standing before the blazing pyre of the ephor's corruption, she came to me of her own will. I took her hand, feeling how it trembled not with fear, but with excitement. The crowd around us continued to celebrate, but we stood in our own world, surrounded by the crackling flames and the intoxicating scent of freedom. Agiatis, I whispered, from this day forward, we build not just a new Sparta, but a new life together. She smiled, and in that smile I saw the strength that had sustained her through years of grief and forced marriage. I have waited for this moment, she said softly, when I could choose to be here, by your side, not because the ephors commanded it, but because my heart commands it. Spherus stepped closer to us, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. The bonds of the old order are burning, he said. But remember, young king, that destruction is only the first step. Now comes the harder task creation. As if his words were a signal, the celebration around us grew quieter. The people of Sparta began to look at me expectantly, their faces serious despite their joy. They had seen me destroy their oppressors, but now they wanted to know what I would build in their place. I climbed onto a piece of fallen masonry from the ephors building, still holding Agiatis' hand, and raised my voice to address the crowd. Citizens of Sparta, I called out. Tonight we have burned the chains that bound us. Tomorrow we begin to forge the tools of our freedom. The land of Sparta, which has been hoarded by the few while many starve, will be redistributed. Every Spartan will have his plot, his place, his dignity restored. A cheer arose from the crowd, but I raised my hand for silence. But freedom requires sacrifice from all of us. We must return to the ways of our ancestors, not to their backwardness, but to their strength. We will eat together, train together, live as equals. The helots who wish it will be free to join our ranks as citizens. But even as the crowd celebrated, I caught sight of figures slipping away into the darkness, supporters of the old regime, no doubt, hurrying to carry word to our enemies. Let them go. Let all of Greece know that Sparta was awakening from its long sleep. As the night wore on and the flames began to die down, I walked with Agiatis and Spherus through the streets of our city. Everywhere we saw signs of change, former debtors embracing their families, craftsmen examining their workshops with new eyes, young men discussing how they would serve in the reformed army. It begins well, Spherus observed, but the real test comes when Antigonus and the other kings realize what you have done. They will not allow this example to spread to their own lands. Let them come, I replied. Sparta has faced greater threats before. Yes, Agiatis added, surprising us both with her military knowledge, but never while rebuilding itself from within. We must be swift in our reforms, my husband. Give the people reasons to fight for this new order before our enemies can organize against it. I looked at her with new respect. In the years since our forced marriage, I had seen her as a beautiful but distant figure, lost in grief for her first husband. Now I realized that she had been watching, learning, preparing for the moment when she could truly contribute to Sparta's future.
What do you suggest?
I asked. Begin the land redistribution immediately, she said. Let every man see his plot marked out before the next full moon. And celebrate it, make it a festival that rivals the old religious ceremonies. Show the people that this new order brings not just justice, but joy. Sparta nodded approvingly. The woman speaks wisdom. A revolution that brings only hardship will not last. The people must feel that they have gained more than they have lost. As we reached the royal quarters, I paused to look back at the dying embers on the agora. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new enemies, new problems to solve. But tonight, for the first time in years, Sparta felt truly alive. I turned to my companions, my teacher who had guided me to this moment, and my wife who had chosen to join me in it. Rest well, I told them. Tomorrow we begin to build the Sparta that Lycurgus dreamed of, but with our own hands and in our own time. As they departed, Agiatis lingered for a moment. Cleomenes, she said quietly, I want you to know what I said about Agiatis being your childhood. I meant that you have grown beyond what he could become. You are not living in his shadow anymore. You are creating your own light. Her words struck me deeply. For years, I had wondered if I was merely following in Agiatis' footsteps, trying to complete what he had started. But tonight had shown me that while I honored his memory and his ideals, my path was my own. I reached out and touched her cheek gently. And you, my dear wife, are no longer bound by the past. We face the future together, as equals in this endeavor. She smiled and went inside, leaving me alone under the stars. The night air was cool, but the warmth of the day's triumph still filled me. I thought of all the challenges ahead, the resistance from other Greek cities, the internal opposition that was sure to arise, the delicate balance between reform and stability. But I also thought of the faces I had seen tonight, farmers realizing they would keep their full harvest, craftsmen freed from crushing debt, young men eager to serve a Sparta they could believe in again. These people had given me their trust, and I would not betray it. As I finally went inside to sleep, I caught the scent of smoke still clinging to my clothes. It was the smell of the old order burning away, making room for something new to grow. Tomorrow would test whether that new growth could survive in the harsh light of reality. But tonight, it was enough to know that we had begun. The pure flame that Agiatis had spoken of would need constant tending to keep it alive. But with her by my side, Sparta to guide me, and the people of Sparta to support me, I believed we could make it burn bright enough to light the way to a better future. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. The weeks following our revolution passed in a blur of constant activity. Each dawn brought new challenges, new decisions that would shape the future of Sparta. I found myself working from before sunrise until well after sunset, meeting with citizens, planning the land redistribution, and preparing our defenses for the inevitable response from our enemies. Sparta had been right about the need for swift action. Every day that passed without concrete changes was a day our opponents could use to organize resistance. I established a council of trusted advisors, including several former helots who had distinguished themselves in recent battles, to help implement the reforms. The land redistribution proved more complex than I had initially imagined. Generations of debt and disputed ownership had created a tangle of claims that took weeks to unravel. Some of the wealthier citizens who had lost property in the reforms attempted to hide their assets or fled to other cities, carrying tales of Spartan madness to any who would listen. "My king," reported Pantaeus, one of my most trusted commanders. 3 more wealthy families departed in the night. They've taken their portable wealth with them and are spreading word that you plan to execute all property owners. I sighed, setting down the scroll I had been reading. The morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been the Ephor's meeting chamber, which I had converted into my headquarters. "Fear makes men believe the worst possibilities," I said. "But perhaps it's better that those who cannot embrace change leave now, rather than work against us from within." Agiatis, who had become my closest advisor in matters of domestic policy, looked up from her own work. She had been organizing the women of Sparta into groups that would help redistribute household goods and establish new community workshops. "The question is not those who leave," she said, "but those who stay and plot. My sources tell me that some of the older citizens are meeting secretly, discussing ways to contact Antigonus. This news troubled me more than the departures. External enemies I could fight with sword and spear, but internal betrayal was a poison that could destroy us from within. "What do you recommend?" I asked my wife. "Transparency," she replied without hesitation. "These secret meetings thrive in darkness, bring all grievances into the light. Hold public assemblies where anyone can speak their concerns. Show that this new Sparta welcomes debate, not just obedience." Sphaerus, who had been quietly listening from his corner, nodded his approval. "The woman speaks with wisdom beyond her years. A king who fears his people's voices is no true king at all." Over the following days I implemented Agiatis' suggestion. Each afternoon, after the day's work was done, I held an open assembly in the agora. The response surprised me. Rather than the angry confrontations I had feared, I found thoughtful questions and genuine concerns. An elderly farmer named Lyciscus raised his hand one afternoon. "My king," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "I support the redistribution of land. My family has struggled for generations, but I worry what happens when other cities unite against us. My sons are eager to fight, but they are young. Will there be enough experienced warriors?" It was a fair question, one I had been grappling with myself. "Lyciscus," I replied, "your concern honors both your wisdom and your love for your sons, but consider this: for years, our young men have had nothing to fight for except the preservation of their debts and the privileges of the few. Now they fight for their own land, their own future, their own dignity. A man defending his home fights with 10 times the strength of a man defending another's wealth." The crowd murmured agreement, but I continued. "Moreover, we are not foolish. Our military reforms include intensive training for all new citizens, including the freed helots. We are creating the largest and most motivated army Sparta has known in generations." Another citizen, a craftsman named Damanon, stood up. "What of trade, my king? The merchants from other cities grow nervous about dealing with us. They fear being associated with revolution. My workshop has lost half its customers." This was another challenge I had anticipated but hoped would resolve itself. "Damanon," I said, "short-term disruptions are the price of long-term freedom. But consider this: once our reforms are complete, Sparta will have more citizens with money to spend than ever before. Yes, foreign merchants may be wary for now, but local demand will grow. And as for foreign trade, there are always merchants willing to deal with anyone who offers fair prices and reliable goods." As the weeks passed, these assemblies became a cornerstone of our new system. They served not only to address concerns but to educate citizens about the broader implications of our reforms. I made sure that Sphaerus often spoke at these gatherings, sharing his knowledge of history and philosophy to help people understand that we were part of a larger tradition of seeking justice. The land redistribution itself began in earnest during the 4th week after the revolution. I had divided the territory of Sparta into equal plots, ensuring that every citizen family would have enough land to support themselves with dignity. The ceremony I established for this process became one of the most meaningful traditions of our new order. Each morning, families would gather at dawn at the Temple of Apollo. After prayers and offerings, we would walk together to the plots that had been surveyed and marked. I personally handed each family head a wooden stake, bearing their name and a small portion of earth from their new land. I remember particularly the day when Brasidius, a former helot who had distinguished himself in our recent campaigns, received his plot. His hands shook as he took the wooden stake from me. "My king," he said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I never imagined that I would own land, that my children would inherit property instead of chains. You earned this through your service and your valor," I replied. "This land belongs to you not through my gift, but through your own merit." But even as these joyous moments filled our days, Darker news came from beyond our borders. Antigonus of Macedon had indeed taken notice of our revolution, and his response was exactly what Sparta had predicted. Pantaeus brought me the intelligence one evening as I dined with Agiatis and several advisors. "My king," he said grimly, "our spies report that Antigonus is gathering a coalition. He has sent envoys to Argos, Megalopolis, and the Achaean League. They're calling our reforms an infection that must be quarantined before it spreads." I set down my cup of wine, feeling the weight of leadership settle more heavily on my shoulders. How long before they move against us? Our sources estimate 2 months, perhaps 3. They're being cautious, wanting to ensure they have overwhelming force before they act. Agiatis leaned forward. "That gives us time, but not much. How many new citizens have we armed and trained?" "Nearly 2,000, I replied. "Combined with our traditional forces, we have perhaps 4,000 men under arms. It's not enough to face a full coalition in open battle." "Then, we don't fight them in open battle," said Sparta. "The mountains of Laconia provide excellent defensive positions. We make them come to us, on ground of our choosing." Over the following weeks, our preparations intensified. I ordered the construction of fortifications at key mountain passes, the stockpiling of weapons and provisions, and the training of every able-bodied citizen in basic military skills. Even the women, led by Agiatis, organized themselves into support units that would maintain supply lines and tend the wounded. But perhaps the most important preparation was psychological. I needed every citizen to understand what we were fighting for, and what we would lose if we failed. "My fellow Spartans," I addressed a massive assembly one evening. "Enemies gather against us because they fear what we have accomplished. They fear that their own people will demand the same justice we have achieved. They call us revolutionaries, as if it were a curse. But I say it is our glory. We have revolted against injustice, against inequality, against the slavery of debt. If that makes us enemies of tyrants, then let us be proud enemies." The crowd's response was thunderous, but I raised my hand for silence. "Yet I will not lie to you about what comes. War is never easy, even when the cause is just. Some of us will not see the end of this struggle. But I promise you this, we will not surrender what we have built. We will not return to the old ways. We will defend our new Sparta with our lives, and if we fall, we will fall as free men and women." In the weeks that followed, as news of the approaching coalition grew more certain, I was struck by the transformation in my people. The demoralized, debt-ridden citizens I had known before the revolution had been replaced by men and women with purpose. They worked harder, trained more diligently, and showed a unity I had never seen in Sparta. One evening, as I walked through the city with Agiatis, we encountered a group of children playing a new game. They were pretending to be warriors defending their homes from invaders, and their enthusiasm was infectious. "Look at them," Agiatis said softly. "They have something we never had at their age. The certainty that they are fighting for something that belongs to them." "Yes," I agreed, "but I pray they won't have to become real warriors too soon." As we continued our walk, we passed the spot where the Ephors building had once stood. A new structure was being built there, not a seat of power for the few, but a community center where all citizens could gather. The symbolism was not lost on me. "Sometimes," I said to my wife, "I wonder if Agus is watching us somehow, seeing what his dream has become." "I think he would be proud," she replied. "But more than that, I think he would want us to look forward, not back. This is no longer his dream or yours alone. It belongs to all of us." That night, as I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the city settling into sleep, I reflected on how much had changed since that first conversation with Sparta about the laws of Lycurgus. Then I had been a boy asking questions about the past. Now I was a man creating the future, and that future would soon be tested in the crucible of war. But I felt ready for that test. Whatever came, we would face it as free Spartans, united in our cause and strengthened by our shared sacrifice. The pure flame that had been lit on the night of our revolution now burned in the heart of every citizen. Let our enemies come, they would find not the decadent, divided city they expected, but a Sparta reborn in the fire of justice. The next morning brought word that advance scouts of the coalition had been spotted at our borders. The time for preparation was ending. The time for battle was about to begin. The first battle came sooner than expected. A dawn patrol reported enemy forces moving through the mountain passes. Not the massive army we had anticipated, but an advance force of perhaps 1,000 men, sent to test our defenses and gather intelligence. I gathered my war council in what had once been the royal quarters but now served as our military headquarters. Maps of our territory covered every surface, marked with defensive positions and supply routes that we had spent weeks planning. They're probing for weakness, observed Pantius, studying the latest reports. This isn't their main assault. They're trying to determine our true strength before committing their full forces. Then we must give them something to report, I replied, but not what they expect to find. I had learned much from Spherus about the value of surprise in warfare. Our enemies expected to find either a chaotic revolutionary rabble or a traditional Spartan force fighting in conventional formations. We would give them neither. Hippomedomicron, I called to one of our newly promoted officers, a former helot whose tactical genius had emerged during training. Take 300 of our newest citizens and harass their flanks. Use the terrain to your advantage. Strike fast. Then disappear. Make them think they're facing twice your numbers. Presidius, I continued, addressing another of our citizen soldiers. Take your mountain fighters and set up positions along their retreat routes. If they break, make sure some escape to tell their commanders what they've seen, but not so many that they feel confident about what they've learned. Agiatis, who had insisted on attending the war council despite the danger, spoke up. What of the main defense? If this is a probe, they'll be watching for our primary response as much as our skirmishing. We hold the center with our traditional forces, I decided. Let them see disciplined Spartan spears and formation, but behind that formation, let them glimpse the size of our true army, without revealing its full composition. The battle that followed would later be remembered as the skirmish at Silesia Pass, though at the time it felt like nothing less than the fate of our revolution hanging in the balance. As I led our central phalanx into position, I could feel the eyes of every citizen soldier upon me. For many of them, this would be their first taste of real combat. The enemy force approached with the confidence typical of coalition armies. They expected to brush aside what they saw as an upstart king with delusions of grandeur. Their formation was professional but unimaginative, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the flanks, light troops screening their advance. What they found instead was a carefully orchestrated lesson in the new warfare we had developed. Hippomedomicron's harassing forces struck their left flank just as they reached the narrowest part of the pass, sending arrows and javelins from concealed positions before melting back into the rocky terrain. The enemy cavalry, trying to respond, found themselves channeled into prepared killing zones, where our citizen archers waited in ambush. Meanwhile, their advance scouts reported back about our main formation, a solid wall of Spartan shields and spears that seemed to stretch much further than it actually did, thanks to careful positioning and the clever use of standards and banners. But the real shock came when they engaged our center. Instead of the rigid, traditional Spartan fighting style they expected, they found an adaptive, fluid defense that bent without breaking, drawing them into increasingly difficult terrain while our flanking forces closed around them. I fought in the front rank, as was traditional for Spartan kings, but I also coordinated the battle through a system of signals we had developed during our training. Horn calls and flag movements allowed us to respond to changing circumstances with a speed that confused and demoralized our enemies. The turning point came when Presidius's mountain fighters emerged from concealment behind the enemy formation, caught between our advancing center and this new threat from their rear. The coalition forces began to waver. "Now," I called, and our entire line surged forward with a battle cry that echoed off the mountain walls. The enemy line broke, and their disciplined retreat quickly became a chaotic rout. But I had planned for this moment carefully. Rather than pursuing with full force and destroying them completely, I allowed perhaps half their number to escape while capturing or killing the rest. The survivors would carry back reports of facing a larger, more formidable army than actually existed. While our victory would boost the morale of our own forces, as the sun set that day, I walked among our wounded, offering what comfort I could. The casualties had been mercifully light on our side, fewer than 50 dead, and twice that number wounded. But each loss weighed heavily on my heart. For these were not anonymous soldiers, but citizens whose families I knew, whose children played in our streets. A king's burden, Spherus observed, joining me as I knelt beside a young farmer named Alexippus, who had taken a spear thrust through his shoulder. Every victory costs something precious. If I had not acted, I replied quietly, how many more would have died slowly from debt and despair? Sometimes the choice is not between war and peace, but between different kinds of suffering. That evening, we held a ceremony to honor our fallen and celebrate our victory. The entire city gathered in the agora, and I noticed how the faces had changed since our revolution began. There was a pride there that had been missing before, a sense of ownership and belonging that no amount of traditional discipline could have created. Citizens of Sparta, I addressed the crowd. Today you proved that free men fight with the strength that slaves can never match. Our enemies came expecting to find weakness, but they found warriors defending their own land, their own future, their own dignity. The cheers that followed were different from the dutiful acclaim I had known as a prince. These came from hearts that were truly engaged, from people who saw their own destiny reflected in our cause. But even as we celebrated, I knew this was only the beginning. The main coalition forces were still gathering, and our small victory would only convince them to take us more seriously. Within weeks, we would face numbers that would dwarf what we had encountered at Silesia Pass. Over the following days, refugees began arriving from neighboring cities. Word of our victory had spread quickly, but so had reports of coalition preparations. Families fled before advancing armies, seeking shelter in the one place that seemed willing to stand against the old order. Among these refugees was an old man named Demarchus, who had been a teacher in Megalopolis before the coalition's agents made his position impossible. He sought me out personally, his lined face bearing the weight of difficult choices. King Cleomenes, he said, I come not just seeking shelter, but offering service. I have taught the children of coalition leaders for 30 years. I know their strengths, their weaknesses, their fears. You are welcome here, I replied. But why leave everything you have built for the uncertainty of war? His answer struck me deeply. Because, my king, I have spent my life teaching children that they must accept the world as it is. Your revolution offers the hope that they might instead create the world as it should be, that is worth any sacrifice. We gave him a place in our expanded council, and his insights proved invaluable. Through him, we learned that the coalition was indeed massive, perhaps 15,000 men drawn from across the Peloponnese and beyond. But we also learned of the tensions within that alliance, the competing interests and ancient rivalries that held it together through necessity, rather than genuine unity. Use their divisions against them, Demarchus advised. They come here united only in their fear of what you represent. Give them victories elsewhere to fight over, and their alliance will strain at the seams. This advice led to one of our most audacious strategies. Rather than waiting passively for the coalition to arrive, we began launching swift raids against their staging areas and supply lines. These weren't intended to inflict major damage, but to force them to divide their attention and resources. Pantaeus led these operations with skill that surprised even me. His raids struck supply convoys, isolated garrison posts, and communication lines with surgical precision. More importantly, they created the impression that our forces were larger and more mobile than they actually were. Let them think we have armies everywhere, I explained to my council. Every shadow becomes a threat, every distant dust cloud a potential ambush. Fear is often more powerful than steel. Meanwhile, our domestic preparations continued. Agiatis had organized the women into an efficient support network that managed everything from food distribution to the care of orphans and widows. The former helots had integrated so successfully into our citizen ranks that visitors could rarely distinguish between old and new Spartans. But perhaps most importantly, we had created something that our enemies could not understand or replicate, a genuine sense of shared purpose. Every citizen knew exactly what they were fighting for because they could see it in their daily lives. The land they tended, the workshops they owned, the assemblies where their voices mattered, all of this was real and immediate in a way that abstract political loyalties could never be. One evening, as I stood on the walls of the city watching the sun set behind the Agiatis mountains, Agiatis joined me in contemplating what lay ahead. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "Every day," I admitted. "Not of dying, that's a risk I accepted when I became a warrior, but of failing these people, of leading them to destruction, for the sake of a dream." "Do you think it is only a dream?" I considered her question carefully, looking out over the city, where our citizens were ending another day of free labor, returning to homes they owned, sitting down to meals they had earned through their own work, rather than another's favor. "No," I said finally. "Dreams are what we see when we sleep. This is what we have built, with our eyes open, with our hands, with our blood. Dreams can be forgotten, but what we have created will echo through history whether we survive or not." She took my hand, and we stood together in comfortable silence as the first stars appeared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of everything we had built. But tonight, we were free citizens of a free Sparta, and that was something no coalition could take away from us without the fight of their lives. The pure flame we had kindled was burning brighter than ever, and it was spreading to places our enemies never expected. Let them come with their armies and their ancient privileges. They would find us ready. If you enjoy this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me and helps me keep writing new stories for you. Thank you for your support. The main coalition army arrived with the changing of the seasons. Just as the autumn winds began to carry the scent of winter from the northern mountains, from the walls of Sparta, we could see their campfires stretching across the plain like fallen stars, and the sound of their preparation carried on the wind. The ring of hammers on anvils, the neighing of hundreds of horses, the murmur of voices in a dozen different dialects. Antigonus had kept his promise. The army that faced us was larger than any force assembled in the Peloponnese within living memory. But as I stood watching their preparations, I felt not fear but a strange kind of peace. Everything we had worked for had led to this moment, and we were as ready as we could be. 15,000. By our best count, reported Pentheus, joining me on the wall. Perhaps more arriving each day. Macedonians, Achaeans, Argives, and mercenaries from as far away as Thrace. "And how many do we number?" I asked, though I knew the answer. 6,000, counting every man who can hold a spear, less than half their strength. In numbers, yes, I agreed, but we have advantages they cannot match. Over the previous months, our intelligence network had grown far beyond what I had initially imagined possible. Refugees, merchants, and even some coalition soldiers had brought us detailed information about our enemy's composition and plans. What we learned was both encouraging and troubling. The coalition was indeed massive and well-equipped, but it was also fragile. Antigonus commanded over all, but each contingent maintained its own identity and priorities. The Achaeans distrusted the Argives, who despised the Macedonians, who looked down upon everyone else as barbarians. They were held together by fear of what our revolution might inspire in their own territories, not by any positive vision of the future. More importantly, we learned that many of their soldiers were conscripts, fighting for causes they barely understood. The Spartan revolution meant little to a Thracian mercenary, except as another job, another paycheck. Our citizens, by contrast, were fighting for everything they had gained and everything they hoped to leave their children. This knowledge shaped our final strategy. We could not win a conventional battle against such overwhelming numbers. But we didn't need to. We needed only to break the coalition's will to continue fighting. to make the cost of conquest higher than the perceived benefit. We make them come to us, I explained to the final war council before the battle. Every step they advance will cost them blood and time. We trade space for casualties. Make them pay for every road, every hill, every stream. Our defensive plan was built around the natural features of our territory. The main roads to Sparta ran through narrow valleys and mountain passes, where superior numbers became a disadvantage. We had spent months preparing these positions, not just with conventional fortifications, but with innovations that would surprise our enemies. Hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes waited along the most likely routes of advance. Rock slides had been prepared at key points, requiring only the removal of supporting timbers to send tons of stone cascading down on advancing columns. Most importantly, we had created multiple fallback positions, each designed to channel the enemy into increasingly disadvantageous terrain. But our greatest weapon was something our enemies could not have anticipated: the complete loyalty of the civilian population. In traditional warfare, armies had to worry about securing their supply lines and controlling conquered territory. The coalition would find no collaborators among our people, no safe havens behind their advancing forces. Every citizen of Sparta, from the youngest child to the oldest grandfather, understood their role in the defense. When the time came, they would evacuate and organize groups to prepared positions in the mountains, taking with them everything of value and destroying what they could not carry. The coalition would conquest empty buildings and salted fields, not a functioning territory. The first assault came at dawn 3 days after their arrival. Antigonus had clearly decided on a direct approach, sending his best troops against what appeared to be our weakest defensive position, a hastily constructed fortification at the mouth of the main valley leading to the city. What he found instead was the first of many unpleasant surprises we had prepared. Our forward position was indeed lightly held, but that was by design. As his forces advanced in overwhelming numbers, they pushed our defenders back through a series of prepared positions, each retreat drawing them deeper into a carefully constructed trap. The crucial moment came when their pursuit entered the narrow defile we had designated as the killing ground. Hidden catapults, operated by crews positioned on the surrounding heights, began hurling not just stones but pots of burning oil into their ranks. The narrow space became a furnace, and their superior numbers became a liability as men trampled each other trying to escape the flames. But even as we celebrated this tactical victory, I knew it was only the beginning. Antigonus was too experienced a commander to be defeated by a single clever ambush. He would learn from this setback and adapt his strategy accordingly. Sure enough, the second assault came not where we expected it, but from multiple directions. Simultaneously, coalition forces struck our positions at 4 different points, forcing us to divide our limited manpower and preventing us from concentrating our defenses. This time, the fighting was harder and more costly. Our mountain fighters, led by Brasidius, held the northern pass against Achaean heavy infantry for most of a day, before being forced to retreat. The eastern approach saw Pantaeus and his citizen soldiers locked in brutal close combat with Macedonian veterans who had learned to respect Spartan steel. By evening, we had been pushed back to our second line of defenses, closer to the city itself. Our casualties, while much lighter than those of the enemy, were still painful. Every fallen defender was a neighbor, a friend, a member of our community. That night, as I walked among the wounded in our improvised field hospital, I encountered a sight that strengthened my resolve more than any speech or prayer could have. Agiatis was there, along with dozens of other Spartan women, tending wounds and offering comfort with a calm efficiency that impressed even our veteran soldiers. "How do they bear it?" asked a young coalition prisoner who had been captured during the day's fighting. He was barely more than a boy, pressed into service in some distant city's army, and the sight of our women working so close to the battlefield clearly amazed him. "They bear it because this is their home," I replied. "These are their husbands, their sons, their brothers fighting for their future. For you, this is just another campaign. For them, it is everything." The boy fell silent, and I could see him thinking about what I had said. Before the night was over, he asked to speak with me privately. He said, his voice hesitant but determined. "I want to join your army. I want to fight for something that matters." I studied his young face carefully. He was clearly sincere. But I had to be certain. "You understand that your former comrades will consider you a traitor, that if we lose, you will share our fate?" "I understand," he replied, "but I have seen how your people fight, how they care for each other. I have heard your citizens talking about their land, their workshops, their hopes for their children. I want to be part of something like that." Over the following days, 6 more coalition prisoners made similar requests. Each time, I questioned them carefully and discussed their cases with my advisors. We could not afford to trust blindly, but we also could not ignore the symbolic importance of enemy soldiers choosing to join our cause. "It's working," observed Sparta during one of our evening councils. "The example is spreading, just as we hoped it would. Even their own soldiers can see the difference between fighting for freedom and fighting for privilege." But the war was far from over. Antigonus had indeed learned from his early mistakes, and his new strategy was more methodical and harder to counter. Instead of costly direct assaults, he began a systematic siege, cutting off our supply routes and gradually tightening his grip around the city. This was the test I had most feared. Our mountain strongholds could hold out for months if necessary, but the civilian population needed food, medicine, and supplies that were increasingly difficult to obtain. Every day of siege brought us closer to the terrible choice between surrender and watching our people starve. It was Agiatis who proposed the solution that would save us. "We cannot win this war by defense alone," she said during a particularly grim council meeting. "We need our enemies to have other problems to worry about." "What do you suggest?" I asked. "We take the war to them," she replied. "Not here, where they expect it, but in their own territories. Let them discover what happens when their own people hear about land redistribution and debt forgiveness." It was a bold plan, perhaps even desperate, but it offered our only hope of breaking the siege. Using our knowledge of coalition supply routes and the intelligence network we had developed, we would strike at the heart of the system that enabled our enemies to maintain their massive army. The pure flame of revolution would spread beyond Sparta's borders, carried by small forces of our most dedicated citizens. Whether we survived or not, the idea would live on, inspiring others to question why they should accept poverty and oppression when alternatives existed. As I prepared for what might be our final gamble, I thought of that first conversation with Sparta so many years before, when I had asked why we could not live by the laws of Lycurgus. Now I knew the answer, not because it was impossible, but because it was so dangerous to those who profited from injustice that they would do anything to destroy it. But some flames, once lit, cannot be extinguished, and ours was burning brighter than ever. The raids began under cover of darkness on the night of the new moon, while Antigonus tightened his siege around Sparta, hoping to starve us into submission. Our strike forces slipped through his lines like shadows and struck at targets throughout the Peloponnese. Pantius led the largest group north toward the Achaean territories, carrying with him not just weapons, but something far more dangerous: copies of our land redistribution decrees translated into local dialects, along with detailed accounts of how former slaves had become citizens in our new Sparta. Hippomed Omicron took his mountain fighters east toward Argos, where intelligence indicated the greatest concentration of war supplies. But his mission too went beyond simple destruction. He carried gold, taken from the former usurers' hordes, not to buy information, but to pay the debts of small farmers and craftsmen who had been pressed into coalition service. I kept the smallest force, perhaps 300 of our most trusted citizens, for the most audacious strike of all. We would penetrate to the very heart of Macedonian territory, to the supply depot at Tegea, where Antigonus stored the provisions that kept his massive army in the field. As we made our way through the darkness, following paths that only shepherds and smugglers knew, I reflected on how much my understanding of leadership had changed since the night we burned the F4's building. Then, I had thought that destroying the old order would be enough. Now I knew that revolution was not a single dramatic moment, but a sustained act of creation that required constant vigilance and sacrifice. The first reports of our raid's success arrived even before we reached our own target, a messenger bird trained by our intelligence network. brought word that Pantius had struck 3 separate supply convoys and distributed his revolutionary pamphlets to the guards before disappearing back into the mountains. More significantly, several Achaean villages had risen in revolt, demanding their own land redistribution and declaring their independence from the coalition. This news filled me with both hope and concern. Our strategy was working. We were indeed spreading the flame of revolution beyond Sparta's borders, but uprisings in other territories would inevitably be suppressed with brutal force, and the blood of those brave farmers and craftsmen would be on my hands. A king's burden, I whispered to myself, remembering Spherus's words. But as we crested the final hill before Tegea, I pushed such doubts aside. The time for hesitation had passed. Now was the time for action. The Macedonian supply depot was larger than our intelligence had indicated, but also more lightly guarded. Antigonus had concentrated most of his forces around Sparta, leaving only a token garrison to protect his rear areas. It was a reasonable calculation under normal circumstances, but our raids had changed those circumstances dramatically. We struck just before dawn, when the guards were sleepy and distracted by reports of other attacks throughout the region. The depot's defenses were designed to repel large-scale assaults, not infiltration by small, highly motivated forces who knew exactly where to strike for maximum effect. Within an hour, flames were consuming grain stores, weapon stockpiles, and siege equipment that had taken months to accumulate. More importantly, we freed nearly 200 slaves who had been laboring in the depot's workshops. Men and women from dozens of different cities who had been captured in various conflicts and put to work supporting the coalition's war effort. "Who are you?" asked one of them, a middle-aged craftsman whose Corinthian accent marked his origins. "Citizens of Sparta," I replied, "and you are free to become citizens as well, if you choose." These slaves had heard rumors about our revolution, stories that had grown in the telling until we seemed like mythical figures rather than real people. To find us in the flesh, offering them not just freedom but citizenship in our new society, was overwhelming for many. "Is it true?" asked a young woman who had been working in the armory, "that former slaves can own land in your Sparta?" "It is true," I confirmed. "But freedom is not given, it is earned. If you choose to join us, you will fight for that freedom. Work for it. Perhaps die for it. We offer opportunity, not charity." By the time we withdrew from Tegea, nearly half the freed slaves had chosen to come with us. The others, understandably, preferred to try to return to their home cities or seek safety in neutral territories. I did not blame them. The choice to join a revolution is perhaps the hardest any person can make. Our return journey proved more difficult than the outbound trip. Coalition forces, alerted by the smoke rising from Tegea, were moving to intercept us. Several times we had to fight running battles with pursuing cavalry, and we lost good people in those encounters. But we also gained unexpected allies. In village after village, we encountered men who had deserted from coalition forces rather than continue fighting for a cause they no longer believed in. Some brought valuable intelligence about enemy movements. Others joined our column as we passed through their territories. The most significant encounter came at a crossroads near Mantinea, where we met a delegation from the city's governing council. I expected them to demand our surrender, or at least to protest our presence in their territory. Instead, they came to negotiate. "King Cleomenes," their spokesman said, "our city has grown weary of this war. The coalition demands ever more men and supplies, but offers nothing in return, except the promise that your revolution will not spread to our lands." "And what do you offer?" I asked, curious to see where this conversation would lead. "Safe passage through our territory," he replied, "and neutrality in the conflict. We will not aid the coalition against you, but neither will we join your cause." It was not the alliance I might have hoped for, but it was progress of a different kind. Fear of our revolution was giving way to a more practical consideration. Why should small cities sacrifice their young men to preserve the privileges of distant kings? I accepted their offer of neutrality, though I left them with something to think about. "Consider this," I told their delegation. "When this war ends, whatever the outcome, Greece will be different. Communities that chose wisely will prosper. Those that clung to the old ways may find themselves left behind by history. When we finally returned to Sparta, after 2 weeks in enemy territory, we found a city transformed. The siege continued, but its character had changed. Instead of slowly tightening the noose around our necks, Antigonus was now forced to deal with uprisings throughout his supply network and defections among his own forces. More importantly, our people had used the time to complete preparations that would allow them to hold out much longer than our enemies had calculated. Hidden stockpiles of food and weapons had been established in mountain caves. Alternative water sources had been developed. Even if the city itself fell, the resistance could continue from strongholds that would be almost impossible to eliminate. But perhaps the most significant change was in the attitude of our citizens. The successful raids had proven that we were not helplessly trapped, that we could strike back at our enemies and defend our allies beyond our own borders. The desperation that had begun to creep into some conversations was replaced by a grim determination to see the struggle through to its conclusion. Agiatis greeted my return with relief that she could not hide, though she tried to maintain the composed demeanor expected of a Spartan queen. "The city held," she reported, "and our people grew stronger while you were away. But Cleomenes, there is something you need to know." She led me to a quiet chamber in our headquarters, where a man I did not recognize waited under guard. He was well-dressed but travel-stained, and his manner suggested both urgency and fear. "This is Alexippus of Megalopolis," Agiatis explained. "He came under a flag of truce 3 days ago, claiming to bear a message from Antigonus himself." I studied the man carefully. Megalopolis was one of the coalition's strongest supporters, and any messenger from there was likely to bring either demands for surrender or attempts at deception. "Speak," I commanded. "King Cleomenes," he said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. "King Antigonus offers terms for ending this conflict. He recognizes that your reforms cannot be completely undone, and he no longer insists on your unconditional surrender." This was unexpected. After months of absolute refusal to negotiate, why would Antigonus suddenly become reasonable? "What terms?" I asked. "You may retain control of Sparta and its immediate territory," Alexippus continued. "Your land reforms may stand, and you may continue to govern as you see fit. In exchange, you must acknowledge Antigonus as overlord of the Peloponnese and provide tribute and military service when called upon." It was, I had to admit, a more generous offer than I had expected. Under these terms, our revolution could survive, our people could keep their land, and the bloodshed could end. Many kings would have accepted such terms without hesitation, but I was not many kings, and this was not a normal conflict. "Take this message back to your master," I said finally. "Sparta bows to no overlord. We have tasted freedom, and we will not trade it for the illusion of security. If Antigonus wants to end this war, he can withdraw his forces and acknowledge our independence. Otherwise, we will continue to fight until one side or the other can no longer continue." The messenger's face showed his disappointment, but not his surprise. He had clearly expected this response. "Then the war continues," he said. "But know this. King Cleomenes' winter approaches, and siege warfare favors the side with larger supplies. How long can your revolution survive when your people begin to starve?" It was a fair question, and one that haunted me as I watched him depart under his flag of truce. We had won significant victories, spread our cause beyond our borders, and proven that our people would fight with courage that surprised our enemies. But could we survive a winter siege against overwhelming odds? The answer, I realized, depended not on our supplies or our fortifications, but on something more fundamental. Whether the flame we had lit was strong enough to burn through the dark months ahead, keeping alive the hope that had sustained us this far. As the first snow began to fall on the mountains around Sparta, I stood once again on the city walls, looking out at the enemy campfires. They seemed fewer now than when the siege had begun, and I allowed myself to hope that our strategy was working, that the coalition was slowly weakening under the pressure of maintaining forces so far from their home territories. But hope alone would not be enough. The real test was still ahead. In the long winter months, when every decision could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The pure flame burned on, but it would need all our strength and wisdom to keep it alive until spring brought the possibility of final victory or honorable defeat. Either way, we would face our fate as free citizens of a free Sparta, and that was something worth any sacrifice. In the distance, I could hear our citizens singing an old Spartan war song, but with new words that celebrated not ancient glories but present hopes. The revolution lived not just in our laws and institutions, but in the hearts of our people, and no siege could touch that sacred flame. Whatever came next, we were ready.